Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Hahn, and I am facilitating the afternoon webinar series for Corwin Press. Welcome to Deepening Your Equity Impact with Gary Howard. Now I'd like to turn over the meeting to Charlene Mayer, Marketing Manager for Diversity, Exceptional Education, Counseling, and Professional Learning. So Charlene, here you go.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Hi, everybody. Thanks again for joining us for this installment of the Corwin Monday afternoon webinar series. Today, we'll be discussing ways to deepen your equity impact with Gary Howard. But before we get started, I wanted to let you know about some of the remaining webinars on our schedule for the rest of the year. Next week, we will have Jackie Walsh and Beth Status discussing how to use the quality questioning process to activate student assessment and support classroom dialogue and provide formative feedback that teachers can use to decide next steps in instruction. After Thanksgiving, we have Paul Bloomberg and Barb Pitchford who will be discussing how teacher teams can take their work to the next level by focusing on their impact on student learning, setting critical learning goals, analyzing evidence, and taking collective action. And then finally, Charlotte Danielson will be capping our Monday afternoon webinar series this year with a discussion on how school leaders can enrich their professional conversations with teachers to improve teacher reflection and learning. So you can register for any of these webinars as well as view archives of past webinars at our website at corwin.com/webinars. Now, I'm very pleased and honored to introduce our expert presenter for today, Gary Howard. Gary is one of the nation's leading experts on cultural competence and culturally responsive practice. So when schools and districts want to engage in sustained equity reform, they often turn to Gary and his team of certified consultants. Gary has more than 40 years of experience working with issues of civil rights, social justice, equity, and diversity in education, including 25 years as founder of the Reach Center for Multicultural Education. He is a keynote speaker, writer, and workshop leader who has traveled extensively throughout the United States and Australia. And he is the author of We Can't Lead Where We Won't Go, An Educator's Guide to Equity, which is published by Corwin. Currently, he is focused on working with districts around the country that are engaged in the Deep Equity Program, which provides educational organizations with the internal capacity to deliver high-quality professional development for social justice and systemic change. So Gary can tell you more about his current work and the changes that school districts are experiencing as a result. And with that, I'd like to turn things over and welcome Gary Howard.
I want to stress that the work that we're doing here is complex work. It's, for me, been lifelong work, and I'm sure many of you listening in feel that this is the core of your work as well. The big question I think that we're dealing with is how do we get demographics out of the way of predicting and determining school outcomes? Another way to say that is how do we close educational disparities around race, poverty, language, special needs, and other dimensions of difference. So it's deep and powerful work we need to do. I think some of the humbling aspects of the last decade and a half of school reform point out to us that that we didn't do the work. No Child Left Behind was a great conceptual idea, but the actual delivery has been disappointing for the last decade and a half. And I think most school districts that I talk to around the country are asking questions about how do we go deeper, how do we make it more systemic, how do we connect with the families and students that we are presently not connecting with, and how do we eliminate the disparities that we continue to see. I think one of the probably the best entry point to our conversation is to talk about some of the key concepts that have been central to our work. We're kind of going away from the idea of diversity and multicultural. Those terms don't seem to have much power and meaning to a lot of educators today. I think we've done a lot of work around multicultural education. We've done a lot of work around diversity training. But again, those practices have not been sufficient to close the gaps and overcome the disparities that we've been seeing. So we need a new set of conceptual tools, and I think those are not so much around diversity. We are diverse. Diversity is a fact. We are multicultural. The issue is, what do we do with diversity? What do we do with our multicultural reality? So let's turn to those key concepts. And the first one being the concept of inclusion. Again, these are the words that speak to what we do with diversity rather than just describing diversity. So how do we create schools and other organizations as well where our students and employees feel welcome, seen, safe, respected, cared for, understood? From a student point of view, it's somebody in this school, some adult has a sense of who I am. Somebody cares about who I am. Somebody wants to know more about the story, the narrative that I bring. Also true for our employees. I do a lot of work with bus drivers, clerical people, building and grounds folks, security folks, support people in school systems, and often they feel marginalized as well in our schools. Sometimes our teachers, educators, and leaders do. So how do we create these places of inclusion? Places that are not just the word safe here, but one of the words that some of my colleagues are using now is brave spaces and soulful spaces where people get to be real. They get to show up as who they really are. And one of the things that we need to talk about with that is that inclusion doesn't mean colorblindness. I love this picture. This was put together by a group of students who are definitely not colorblind. They lined themselves up by the skin tones, and they have names for their skin tones: strawberry, vanilla, chocolate, mocha. They have an ongoing conversation about skin tone and differences. And we're not only talking about race today, we're talking about all the differences that show up in our schools. But the beginning point with inclusion is that we don't create inclusion by pretending that differences don't make a difference. Differences make a difference. They don't have to get in the way, but if we don't pay attention to them, they often get in the way. And that's a paradigm shift that I find a lot of educators, even those in highly diverse schools, still come from a place of pretending like differences don't exist. I treat them all the same. I don't see differences. I don't see race. Particularly, this comes from my colleagues, white educators, who are usually the ones that talk about their colorblindness as somehow being a goal of their work. It's actually profoundly insulting for people of color when we pretend like differences don't exist. So we'll start with that one, inclusion. And the next key concept is the concept of equity, which is a driver of most of our school systems, particularly those that are increasing in diversity. Most of the places we're working around the country now are school districts that are rapidly increasing in their cultural, racial, linguistic, immigrant, sexual orientation, religious differences. And we also work in highly impacted urban systems, which have been highly diverse, a majority of kids being from groups other than white or middle class or English speaking. So equity is a key issue in all of our systems. And we like to stress in our work that this is not only about what we measure, and we certainly measure a lot. We measure outcomes by all of the subgroups, which I think is a good outcome of No Child Left Behind. We had to pay attention to our outcomes based on subgroups of race and language and culture and special needs and the way kids show up in our schools. So we had to measure that and look at it and report it. But also things we don't measure. One of the schools I worked in recently had a high school, which was a third white, a third black, a third Latino, and all of the cheerleaders historically had been white females. And one of the teachers asked me, "Gary, do you think that's a problem?" And I said, "Well, what do you think? It's definitely not equitable. How come all other students have been excluded from a function like cheerleading?" And they said it was tradition. And so equity has a lot to do with some of the things that we have traditionally done in our schools, which actually don't have equitable outcomes for all of our kids. In this case, students, young women who are black and Latino, didn't even think of themselves as being a potential candidate for cheerleading, let alone young men in the school. So after paying considerable attention to this issue, it took about 5 years actually to get more students into that pipeline and change that inequitable outcome. We're not necessarily measuring or reporting our cheerleader by race and subgroup to the federal government, but it's key in our schools. The other part of this definition is that we want to reduce those negative outcomes for all groups and increase the positive outcomes. Graduation rates, attendance in higher level courses, disproportionate referrals to special ed or discipline rates. How do we reduce the negative outcomes and increase the positive outcomes for all groups? So this is a kind of a working definition of equity. And again, one of the paradigm shifts that we need to look at here is that equity doesn't equal same. Equity doesn't mean equality. This is another kind of, I think, misperception that a lot of educators have, particularly when they say, I treat them all the same. One kindergarten teacher told me that all my kindergarten kids show up with the same stuff, which was totally not true in her school, with highly disparate economic and language and kind of school preparation, prior knowledge coming to kindergarten. And she said, all my kids come with the same stuff, but then, and then I treat them the same when they show up. This kind of notion of sameness or fairness equals giving everybody the same. So this picture has been around on the web quite a bit. You've probably seen different versions of it, where the little person on the left-hand side, equality side, is not even able to see the game, not in the game. How many students in your school are not in the game? They don't see the game, not in the game, and we have to rearrange things, rearrange the resources, rearrange our distribution of attention and strategy to get everybody at least seeing the game. But then I want to ask you a question about what's wrong with this picture. Because as you look at this design, and this is one thing I ask people all over the country, what's the problem with this picture? We could say, yeah, we redistribute the boxes, everybody gets to see the game. And one of the issues that always comes up in that conversation is, what about the fence? So what I challenge you to think about is, in your school system, how many kids and by what dimensions of diversity are outside the fence? What is the fence? How does the fence keep kids out? And rather than rearranging the boxes, how about we take the structural impediments out of the way? For the school with the cheerleaders that were always white, that meant getting rid of that tradition. The tradition was a fence. Some of our school systems are taking away sort of computer-based homework because they realize that kids have such differential access to computers at home. So one of the school districts that one of my grandkids is in doesn't do that, doesn't base your homework on having a computer at home. All that is done at school. That's another barrier that could be a fence. Access to higher level courses, what keeps kids of color, low-income kids, sort of differently abled kids, and often kids with different learning styles from being identified as gifted. So the fences, how do we take those down? What are the fences in your system? So that's something to think about around the issue of equality and equity. And then the third key concept is one of excellence, which is usually written into all of our school districts' goals and visions and desired outcomes, that we will do an excellent job with all our students. And I certainly feel that most school systems do try to keep the bar as high as they can in everything they do. But the other side of excellence that we stress in the deep equity work is that it's not only about test scores or compliance, but it's also about educating young people for reflective democratic citizenship. On the eve of the election that we're in right now, I think we could say that, and I could say as a social studies educator, we have left a lot of our citizens in this country severely behind in terms of having the capacity to think critically, to not be manipulated based on their fears or their racism or their xenophobia. We have a lot of people who are highly vulnerable to negative political rhetoric. And that's a function of not having reflective democratic citizenship skills. So part of our excellence is, are we educating young people to be smart citizens, to be engaged citizens? Particularly a concern of mine, I was the student who was top in every area. Grades were perfect all through high school, SAT scores, graduated with a scholarship to a major elite university, and nothing prepared me in my high school for dealing with the world of diversity that I entered when I went to college in the late 1960s. So I'm a kind of exhibit A, I think, of being somebody who's smart in school and was utterly ignorant in terms of the world. So substance, depth, critical thinking, key issues in the excellence agenda. And for this reason, I encourage you, whenever you hear that term college and career ready, which became such a mantra of the school reform movement, it has kind of really, I think, kind of a corporate feel to it. Let's get the folks ready for jobs. So let's get them to college and get them ready for jobs. But I would really encourage you, which is a great goal, but really encourage you to add that other C, which is culture ready. Culture ready means you're ready to live in a world as a productive citizen, and you know that other people don't think like you, believe like you, practice their sexuality like you, they don't speak the language you speak, and their culture is as powerful and as valid and as important as yours. So how do we get this across to our young people? So those are the key three concepts, I think, that some of the school districts I work with have now built those into their vision statements: inclusion, equity, and excellence, and redefining excellence in this broader sense. And what I'd like to do now is give you a sense of what is the work, really. If we talk about deep equity and delivering on these three key concepts, the phases of the work that we go through, and this is work with adults. Schooling is a people-intensive industry, a business that's people-intensive. We have books, we have buildings, we have buses, we have, the sort of the substance of material support for systems, but it's really about people connecting to people in our systems. And the adults in the schools are the primary focal group for the deep equity work. And it proceeds in 5 phases of the work. The first one being tone and trust. Many of the school systems we work with around the country, the real need, before we can even begin the conversation about inclusion, equity, and excellence, is can the adults in this school talk to each other reasonably, authentically, honestly, about difficult issues related to equity, diversity, race, class, culture, sexual orientation, religion? Can they talk effectively? Can they talk honestly without adult drama getting in the way? So a lot of the schools we work with around the country, tone and trust is probably almost a year-long process and project for them before they even get into some of the deeper conversations, because the other conversations get stalled when the adults can't talk to each other in this way. In the second phase, and these are not just linear sequential phases, they probably should be called facets of the work, I think, is the one of personal culture and personal journey. And from my work over 40 years, particularly with white educators, and 85% of the teachers in the country are white educators. So if we're talking about changing schools and improving schools, 85% of that population that we're dealing with are white educators. It's not only about white educators, but I say it's seriously about white educators in terms of just percentage in the profession, that we really need to acknowledge that everybody brings a personal cultural narrative to the story, and educators who don't know their own personal cultural narrative, haven't connected with it, haven't critiqued their own biases as well as their own cultural background, can be a danger in the classroom, because we need to know where we come from. We need to know how we interface with where our students come from. So there's a lot of work we do around personal culture and personal journey, and that connects very closely to the tone and trust. So those processes are significantly important in going to the next one, which is understanding social dominance and social justice. And this is the phase of the work that often school reform did not deal with. It didn't really deal with the fact that the disparities we see in schools are actually undergirded by historical inequities that have been built in systemically and structurally to our society since the beginning. So how do we move from systems of social dominance, i.e. in our country, only white male property owners could vote in the beginning of this country, and they mandated that themselves by writing that constitution and setting the ground rules for white male property owners being the only ones who could fully participate. And how do we move to a much more inclusive and socially just system that includes everybody else? And to me, this is the foundation of the question about where do gaps come from. If we don't deal with the systemic inequities built into the society, how do we deal with the systemic inequities that get reflected in schooling? And for most part, school reform folks did not want to deal with that. If you're going to end disparities based on race, you have to deal with racism. If you're going to end disparities based on poverty, you have to deal with economic inequality. You need to at least talk about those issues around privilege, preference, and power. So this is a stage that is important. I encourage schools to enter this stage in a sense that when they're ready, when they have the tone and trust, when they have developed that foundation. And then the fourth phase is job-related applications and classroom particularly, culture-responsive practice, culture-responsive teaching. Most of the work we do in deep equity is in this fourth phase of the work. What does it mean for me as a counselor, as a principal, as a custodian, as a teacher, as a bus driver, as a front office clerical person? How does cultural competence, cultural responsiveness come into my work? And then the final phase of the work is systemic planning. This is really the leadership function, and maybe listening, maybe coming at this from a leadership point of view. I call courageous equity leadership. We need to think about what does it mean systemically to move our schools, our practices, our people, and how do we be planful about that change. So what I'd like to do is give you one practical example of an activity that we use in the tone and trust phase of the work. I call it tone and trust assessment. This may be something you could do. You could use this, anytime in your school systems. But that key question I asked, to what extent have we established this tone and trust to have authentic conversations? And you ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 meaning you can't talk about anything, we're having a lot of difficulty, 10 meaning we have an open and honest, inclusive conversation of the adults. And you ask people to, in an anonymous way, Google Doc, gather this data, and you get a very kind of quick assessment of how people are feeling about your culture and environment around tone and trust. I'll give you an example. This is the way I was working, that came out in a focus group of about 20 high school folks in a high school faculty, about 150. I spoke with a small group and asked them to do this. And this is how their tone and trust assessment came out for that group, which obviously highlighted the fact that we have sort of two different perspectives, kind of a bifurcated perspective on how well we're doing around tone and trust. And as they pushed deeper into this, it became the people that felt good about the new principal and the people that wanted the old principal back. Some of the schools I'm in, this could be an age-related, long-term teachers, younger teachers. It could be politics that divides. And how do we bring these kind of things together? So the tone and trust assessment is one that it's an easy kind of and quick assessment, but I encourage you, if you do this, you have to be ready to respond to it because the data is powerful. What I'd like to do is pause a minute. Jeff, if we have people who are ready with a question, do you have any questions for us at this point? I'll make some space here for that.
At this point, we don't have any questions right now. If anybody has any questions that they'd like to send us through the chat feature, we would love to have them. So I'll be monitoring the chat feature. And so if you have any questions, send them along, please.
Okay, I encourage you, or comments too. If you want to just put a comment in, Jeff could bring that in and I could comment on your comments. So please feel free to participate in that way. So let's move on. I want to give you another conversation because part of the goal of today's webinar is just to give you an idea of practical strategies to engage these conversations in this work. Another one that I've found very helpful is what I call the lenses of difference conversation. And this is one where we acknowledge all the different ways that both our employees as well as our students, our families show up in our schools, our school systems, our classrooms, our universities, and to acknowledge that difference is a broad-based concept, not just about race and language and special needs and poverty, some of the things that we measure again and sort of mandated school reporting, but every student, every employee shows up with a multitude of diversities. There is no such thing as a classroom which is not diverse. My first teaching job was in a school system that racially was 98% white. But if you looked beneath that in terms of the racial factor and looked at poverty issues, family background issues, level of education of the families of my students, if you looked at special needs, if you looked at personality, if you looked at learning styles, sexual orientation, gender, the huge diversity. So the first kind of paradigm shift is that diversity is not single dimensional. The other is that everybody carries multiple diversities. I think one of the problems with the way we carried out the school reform movement was by identifying subgroups, we tended to see kids as race or see them as poverty, or maybe see them as a combination of race and poverty, language diversity, special needs, and not recognizing there's a whole other set, a larger set of diversities that every student brings to our classroom. And one of the questions I ask people is, what else would you add to this? So some of you may want to type this into the chat feature when you look at my list, and there's a couple empty boxes there that what diversities are important to you and in your experience in schooling and the places you work. What others would you add to this? So I'd be interested to know if anybody wants to suggest one or two of those. The conversation that I would suggest you have with your colleagues around this concept of lenses of difference is to ask people, pick one of these diversities for which you have had a personal struggle in your life, in your work, in your family, and describe what that struggle was about. What this does is democratizes the conversation around difference. We're not trying to do what I call comparative suffering here, that my struggle, say, with now being 70 years old and age is a big factor for me, and I'm wondering how long I should work and whether my health is going to hold together and do I have enough finances to survive, so it's an age-related story that I could tell. I'm not pretending that that is an equally intense issue to somebody's lifelong experience of homophobia or racism or poverty. So you have to be careful about what I call comparative suffering when you're having these conversations. But the fact that everybody has experienced issues around equity and diversity related to some of the, and it may be their children. A lot of teachers, when I do this, when I talk about their kids, their own family, their own children, or their parents. You can also ask them to talk about how they see these issues showing up in the school, not maybe just personally, but also how they see it, these issues happening for their students. So the lenses of difference conversation I would encourage you to have. It kind of broadens the definition of difference, brings a lot of other conversations in, and I have actually found it a good tool even to zero in on issues like race, where first of all you have a broad-based conversation about the way people have experienced difference in their own lives, and then you move in to some of the more difficult, intense, and necessary conversations like those around race. All right, let's move on now to definition of cultural competence. So this is another key conceptual frame. What I'm trying to give you here are some key conceptual frames to use in your work, as well as possible activities, applications. And the definition of cultural competence is one that I call a functional definition of cultural competence. In other words, what is it? How do we do culturally competence? What does it look like? And I like this combination of words. It's based on a lot of the research on cultural competence. The will and the ability to form authentic and effective relationships across difference. And each of those words is powerful in terms of its implications. First of all, the will. Remember I talked earlier about the issue of color-blindness. So the will to see differences, not just race, but the will to see differences, to know that differences make a difference. This seems like kind of a no-brainer, but when you actually get into it, a lot of educators, again, try to, in a sense, whitewash the conversation around differences. Let me give you an example. I have a multiracial, multicultural, multireligious family, but my granddaughter, Mina, who is 12 now, middle school, but this would happen when she was, I think, about 6 or 7. She was having a play date at a friend's house, a white family. My daughter is white, and so my daughter, Rhea, came to pick up Mina, and they sat down and had dinner with this white family, and Mina's the only person of color at the table. And the 4-year-old brother looks across the table and says, so everybody can hear it, how come she's brown? So the word is out, how come she's brown? The mother, the white mom, did what I call the classic white mommy response, and you maybe could guess what that response was, which was to shush her child. So it was the shushing response to difference. And what's the message to the 4-year-old when mommy shushes me for asking this question? Of course, the message is there's something wrong with this. So there's a lot of research on how kids pick up their attitudes about race, and this is one of the classic ways they pick up from adults that there's some problem with this thing around race. But my granddaughter, Mina, just a nanosecond after mommy shushed this young 4-year-old, my granddaughter Mina, who has conversations about race all the time, spoke up and said, my daddy's black, my mommy's white, that's how I came out brown. And the 4-year-old brother, although he didn't say this, the expression on his face, my daughter said, was like, wow, that makes sense, you know, I can understand that, it makes sense, why can't we talk about that? So the will is the difference. Teachers often tell me, I don't see race, all the kids are the same to me. So the will to pay attention to difference. The ability is a skill, set of skills, and we'll talk about those in a minute. Those are the skills of cultural responsive practice. So it's not only the will, but it's the skill. So the will, the skill, the choice, and the ability to form authentic. And authentic is the key measure for our students. And how we know whether we have authentic relationships with our students is we ask our students. If you're doing climate surveys, if you're doing interviews with students, if you're bringing student voice in, which I encourage you to do, you can find out very quickly to the extent to which young people, students and children feel that the adults are being real. You can ask that in different age-appropriate ways. One high school had a 60% dropout for Latino kids, could name only 10 teachers out of 150 in that high school who they felt cared to know who they were. So there was a real measure of lack of authenticity. And the final word there is effective. The relationships are effective, and this means they work, that kids are learning. Differences are being acknowledged. Disparities are being reduced. That the practice is effective. So this definition of cultural competence is not just about the forming of relationships, but it's also about the delivery of equity in our schools. So this definition, and I'd like to give you just a more clear statement, I think, on why colorblindness doesn't work, just to make that a little more clear for you, is that differences make a difference. I said this earlier. They don't have to get in the way. A lot of people are afraid that if we talk about differences, somehow we're going to get into some kind of problematic conversation, or people would think we're racist if we talk about race. So differences make a difference. They don't have to get in the way. If we pretend the differences don't exist, then we're in the way. So I would encourage you to go over this concept in your schools, particularly as those schools that are growing in diversity. And teachers have not been so used to having a lot of difference in their classrooms, and they want to pretend like it doesn't exist. I would really encourage you to have this conversation around why colorblindness doesn't work. And then let's move to the practical or application side, which is what I call phase 4, which is culture responsive practice. And I'm going to mainly look at this through the lens of teaching. And so we're going to talk about culture responsive teaching and 7 principles. I encourage you, as you listen to this, to be thinking about best practices in your schools, in your systems on each of these. Think of people that are good at these, think of your own practice, think of areas that you'd like to improve, maybe think of some of the barriers that you see. And the first one, excuse me, is that students are affirmed in their cultural connections. And this is critical. This is that authenticity piece that for students, I think this means kids get it that we get them. In other words, kids get it that these adults or this adult in this classroom has some clue about who I am. It doesn't just mean my racial identity. It doesn't just mean my sexual orientation. It doesn't just mean my gender identity. It means being a 4-year-old, being a 10-year-old, being an athlete, being interested in drama, whatever the interests and focus of the student or the personality, the teachers, the adults have a sense of who the kids really are. My own grandson in this one told me an interesting story where this was when he was in 3rd grade. He's a high school kid now, but I remember the story. He said he was having trouble with his 3rd grade classroom, getting in trouble for the first time ever, and he thought the teacher favored girls, and he said the girls are all getting along fine and not getting in trouble, and the boys are getting in trouble. And I said, well, why do you think that is? And well, first of all, he said, I think teachers burn out, and then he said, I think she just favors girls. I think she's uncomfortable with boys. But how did he pick this up as a 3rd grader? You know, and the teacher definitely had some struggles around connecting with the males in the classroom. So that's an example of students not being affirmed in their cultural connections. Here's the second one, which is teachers are personally inviting, and my colloquial phrase here is kids get it that we like them, that we enjoy them. The first principle is kids get it that we have a sense of who they are, that we get them. This is that kids get it that we enjoy being with them. Very important for young people to feel that the adults who are working with them actually enjoy who they are. A story that comes on this one is a friend of mine that teaches 11th grade English at the high school level, and African-American teacher. And he said, Gary, it took me maybe 10 years of teaching to really get this one, where I was a good teacher. I thought I was handling things pretty well in my classroom, but in the 10th year of my teaching, one of my juniors in high school was killed in a car accident over the weekend. And I realized I didn't know the kid. I really didn't know who he was. I didn't know much about him other than just he was in my class. And he said, I started a practice after that every Friday afternoon I would sit by the door, and as kids are leaving each of the 5 periods, 150 kids a day, and he'd stand by the door and say a name, eye contact, pat on the shoulder, have a good weekend, good having you here this week, have a safe weekend, see you Monday. He said it totally changed his approach to his teaching, and the kids actually started reinforcing it. They wanted to have that connection, even though it was a brief connection once a week at the door. It changed the way he focused on his teaching. Third one, classroom is physically and culturally inviting. School looks and feels like me. It kind of feels like home. I see myself in the languages and the images and the people populating the school, the adults in the school. When families come in, they feel that they're welcome. That's an office, so important in this one. These first 3 are really the front porch. The front porch is the place where we welcome folks into the school. A lot of our kids, particularly those that are most marginalized, need that invitational approach to the front porch. And this one, the fourth one, is more the academic one, that students are reinforced for academic development. I call this one catching kids being smart. The key in principle 4 is belief in the intelligence of our kids. We can say we have high expectations for all kids, but belief is much deeper than that. Belief is in our gut and in our heart that we know that our kids have the capacity to deliver and to learn. And this is something we want to infect them with in a positive way. One of the stories here is a elementary school in Seattle where I live. Wonderful principal did an amazing turnaround of an inner city, high poverty, Black Latino school. Did amazing work, John Moorfield at Hawthorne Elementary. And he goes and watches his kids graduate from high school, 5, 6 years after they leave him. And one of the high school girls who was graduating with honors from a high school in Seattle came to John, who was her principal back in elementary, and said, Mr. Moorfield, you and the teachers at Hawthorne made us think we were smarter than we thought we were. This is the epitome, the definition, I think, of principle 4. You as adults made us think we were smarter than we thought we were. Again, particularly for our kids that are more marginalized, kids caught in the so-called gaps. That is critical, adult belief. And then the fifth one is how we change it up. We sometimes call this differentiation, but I think it's deeper than that. It's not just a technique. It's like we have a passion to actually, what I call, sing harmony to the music of our kids. The way our kids are smart, the way they show up, we get a sense of that, and then we change the way we teach to fit who they are. Rather than teaching who we are and how we like to learn, we teach who our kids are and how they like to learn. This particularly becomes a problem in, again, schools that are rapidly changing in diversity, where teachers often feel that there's a problem with the students. In other words, what I've been doing for 25 years has worked really well for the kids who have always been in my classroom. Now it's not working. And the tendency is to blame families, blame diversity, blame the kids. Sometimes I tell teachers, you're doing a great job teaching kids who don't live here anymore. Your population has shifted. So this is that singing harmony to who our kids really are, not just teaching them our song, but learning to sing harmony to theirs. And then the sixth one is the classroom management one, firm, consistent, caring. And this is the one that is really, I think, the concept of the art of preemptive respect. That a lot of our students, again, come not necessarily respecting us just because we're a teacher. Again, that's kind of a middle class mindset that I got growing up, was I respected adults first, and then they would respect me. I think we need to do that in a lot of our classrooms. We need to show in a very strong, real way our respect for our kids so that they can be free to show their respect for us. It's not a deficiency in the kids, it's been a survival tool for a lot of kids, not necessarily to trust all the adults in their life just because they're adults, and that passes on to us as well. So the issue of preemptive respect in our classrooms. And the example that comes there is a middle school teacher, a friend of mine, who was kind of protecting, I guess, over helping out a young African-American male. She's Latina, he's African-American. She knew that he was on the edge of being suspended from his school. He had been disciplined several times, and there was a situation where he was walking through the hall with his cell phone, which was against the rules, and a teacher was pursuing him to, bust him for having the cell phone, talking out in the hallway. And she intervened because she knew this kid is the responsible adult in his family, even though he was only 14 years old. He was handling a family crisis with a younger brother in the family. He needed to be on the phone. She pulled him into her classroom, and she told him, handle your business, then give me the phone. And she interceded with the other teacher to let them know that, this was not the appropriate time to be, dealing with discipline with this kid. That discipline needed to be instructive and supportive rather than punitive. So that's another key part of Principle 6. Our discipline procedures are instructive, not punitive. And then with interaction, stress, collectivity, as well as individuality, which is number 7, a lot of our kids come front-loaded to be competitive, to function as individuals. That was me. I think kids that come ready to do school as school now exists are very much into an individualistic notion and into a competitive notion and performing on their own. But a lot of our kids, again, particularly those who come from more marginalized groups, I'm thinking of Native American kids, often come from more traditional Native American kids, and it's not true of every Native kid, but more traditional Native American kids come with a very collective notion of learning and a collaborative and cooperative and communitarian approach to learning. And if we put them into highly stressful and competitive individualistic structures, sometimes that is a problem. So my feeling is we need to help students do both. A student like me who is highly competitive needs to learn to be collaborative. The student who is more collaborative and more collectivist in their approach, more social in their learning, needs to learn to function on their own. But we need to be understanding of that and using grouping wisely and moving between group processes, small group, large group, individual. It's using grouping wisely in the classroom. So these are 7 principles of culturally responsive practice, and I would encourage you to think about these in terms of your own practice. Think about them in terms of which of these are particularly strong for you, which of these maybe are ones you want to grow in. If you're a principal of a school, leader in the system, you might think, which of these are my teachers in my building particularly strong at? And one of the activities you can do with this, when you talk about these principles with your folks, is to ask them to let you know which is their most proficient. Which of these 7 do they feel like the strongest in? Which maybe they could even support other teachers and in a kind of each one teach one way to mentor other teachers, coach other teachers, and also which one is one that they feel less secure in. That would be their growth principle, where they need to expand their practice and go deeper. And then what I do is create a kind of a profile, a grid of that. The 7 principles and the teachers' names under each principle that feel really strong in that principle. And then that's your proficient list. And then you do a growth list of the principles and teachers' names that feel that that's an area they want to grow in. And then you have amazing structure that you could use in faculty meetings of people meeting by growth group or by proficient group, growth group folks asking proficient group folks for advice on scenarios in their classroom. So the 7 principles can be a strong tool. It comes from the Shade, Overg, and Kelly book of Creating Culture Responsive Classrooms. It's an older book, but the model that I have found really, really helpful. In the Corwin material, you get the reference on that, Shade, Overg, and Kelly, colleagues of mine from Minneapolis. Let's stop now, Jeff, and see if we have more questions or comments.
Yes, hi, I do have a question. It's from Brenda. When doing this work with districts and schools, How do you connect this work back to the school's approach to family and community engagement, reaching past the student? We talk about how schools can't do what they need to do on their own. It is a family, community, and school responsibility together to ensure our children's educational attainment.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a great question. I think most of the school systems we're working in around the country really have connected the deep equity work with their family engagement, community engagement, parent involvement approach. Because if you look at those first three principles, particularly the affirmation of cultural connections, the personal invitingness, and creating spaces that are inviting not only for kids but for families, that's been a key in a lot of our schools. I'm thinking of one that was rapidly growing in language diversity, immigrant status, a lot of undocumented kids and families in the school, and parents felt insecure, as a lot of folks do. They feel insecure interfacing with official institutions like schooling, and the school created a whole new kind of entryway to their building. They didn't construct it differently. They just used some paint. They used a coffee and tea. They had parents welcoming parents as they're dropping off to school, and it became an informal gathering place for parents in that school. What used to be very institutional and kind of a more cold institutional environment in the front office became, in a sense, a family gathering. They had couches, coffee, tea, as I said. Teachers would come there, principal would be there, language translation is happening there. So that front porch particularly, I think, is an area, Brenda, where we can think about the interface of family engagement and this work in the school. Another school I'm working with in Pennsylvania takes their teachers now, because of this work, on a tour of the neighborhood before the school year starts. So they get on a bus and they do stops all around the neighborhood where their kids come from. And a lot of the teachers have never been in the neighborhood where the kids in the school come from. And when the families see, now this is the second year they've done it, when the families in the neighborhood know the teacher bus is coming, so it's not a bus to pick up kids, this is a bus bringing teachers into the neighborhood, then they're there to show them where the laundromats are, show them where the restaurants are, show them the parks. And it's become an amazing transformational experience for the educators, not just having the parents learn about the school, but having the educators learn about the community that the parents come from. So hopefully, Brenda, that gives you some idea of the interface of this. I don't think you can do this work, and we're talking about deep transformative work around closing these social inequities and educational inequities, political inequities in our systems. You can't do that work without engaging the families, the neighborhoods, the communities. Do we have another one there, Jeff?
No, that's the only question I have at this time, Gary.
Okay, all right. Let's go to my last slide, and then we'll see if there's any more questions. I'd like to address this last one, particularly to leadership people, but I think it goes for teachers, support staff, everybody. This is an approach that I use when I'm particularly doing work with the superintendent's cabinet, school boards, leadership folks, principals, but I think it's applicable to everybody. And what are the actions that we need to take for, racial equity, socioeconomic equity, language equity, equity across all the diversities in our schools? And the first one is, these are kind of action words that we really need to be open about the disparities that exist in our schools. And here again, I think the No Child Left Behind school reform movement has, prompted us, required us to report our data by subgroups. But we really need to be clear. Some schools, I still find, have not been clear with their communities, with parents, and I think with students. One of the main groups we need to fire up about knowledge about disparities are the kids. When the kids start learning about the racial disparities of their own group, they become motivated to want to change those. So informing people about the disparities that exist in our schools, and not only the ones that we report, but the ones that are also happening maybe under the surface. And then this issue of igniting, I think the sense of urgency and passion for the work. In some ways, it's re-engaging or reigniting people's interest. I think one of the downsides of top-down punitive school reform has been a lot of educators have been dispirited. They've been kind of turned off. They've been kind of overwhelmed or burnt out, actually, when I go into school systems. I would probably have engaging a new round of equity work is that people feel kind of a lack of trust, and they feel a kind of exhaustion from the past 15 years of school reform. They're not sure they want to buy in. So we need to ignite this sense of urgency and passion. Martin Luther King, in his I Have a Dream speech, one of the phrases that we often forget was the one that said the fierce urgency of now. We remember the dream part of the speech, but to me the most powerful phrase was the fierce urgency of now, which is fierce now as it was in 1963 when he said that. And then inspiring with the vision that we can do this, we can actually do this work. We can turn things around using any of the evidences you have of the turnaround, the change in data, the improvements, the closing of gaps. And we need to continue to inspire people that this work can be done, modeling the vision in our own work. For teachers, that means that sometimes we hide our talents under a basket. We don't want to let folks know how effective we are. We don't want to be identified as that teacher who maybe is standing above others. But we need to model this work, and particularly as leaders. That we can't be requiring teachers. If I'm a principal, I can't be requiring my teachers to be open and culturally competent with their kids when I'm not being that way with the adults in my building. So we need to model that. And then supporting and sustaining the work. I think this is particularly from principals and central office. What I found often is some schools are doing really good work, but they're not getting the support and sustaining work sometimes from the central office. So we need to line that up. The alignment of this work from central office to school is a critical factor. So I will leave that there, and unless there's any other questions, Jeff, we'll go on to some of our final information from Corwin. Any more comments or questions?
No, we're all set. Thank you. What a great presentation. Thank you, Garen.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think, Charlene, this is where you come back in, right?
Yep. So
Okay.
Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you very much, Gary, for all the wonderful information. I hope everybody found it useful and helpful in your work. And what Gary has just discussed is only a very brief preview of the work that he does in partnership with Corwin in school districts around the country. So I thought we can go over some of the resources that are available to you if you are interested in engaging in this work in your own school or district. We do have a leader's manual available that you can use to walk groups, your leadership team, and also teachers through the 5 phases of the deep equity work. This manual includes more than a year's worth of professional learning, and you can guide groups through the 5 phases with step-by-step directions and group exercises. And there's also over 9 hours of video featuring Gary, as well as educators and classroom footage that you can use for discussion and to introduce different exercises. So that's available at Corwin.com, and as a special for exclusive discount for attending this webinar, we are offering a 10% discount code at Corwin.com. For individual teachers who are interested in learning more about culturally responsive teaching practices, we do have online courses that are self-paced. So teachers can start and pause at any time, move through them at their own pace, or teams or entire schools can also take courses together. We have seen that as part of effective PD, where teachers can complete modules at their own pace, and then during team meetings or staff meetings or PD days, they can come together and debrief and discuss what they've learned. Another option for schools is the Deep Equity PD Resource Center, which is an online resource that allows educators to share the materials from the Leader's Manual, the printed manual, across a building site or even across a district. So the online resource has all the same exercises, videos, facilitator notes, and resources that are in the printed manual, but the online platform allows teachers to access the materials from anytime, anywhere. So this opens up flexible PD options for busy educators and allows leaders to maximize face-to-face time that you have for discussion. And we are offering free trials to school and district leaders. You can just go to our website at Corwin.com, go to the online PD page, and request a 2-week trial. And we also have consulting services available if you need assistance developing a PD plan for sustainable equity work. Gary does have a team of certified deep equity consultants who can work side by side with your school or central office leadership team to build internal capacity and to conduct training on the 5 phases of the deep equity work. So there's also a corresponding youth program for engaging students as community and campus leaders. So you can build sustainable equity work at both the adult level and also with your students. So if you want more information about that, you can visit us at corwin.com/deepequity. And then finally, if you want to catch Gary and go through 2 days of intensive work in the Deep Equity program, you can catch him next April in Boston at the 2017 Corwin Equity Institute. Details are still forthcoming, so if you want to be notified, feel free to sign up and get alerts, and we will let you know once we have more details and once registration is open. And that is it. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I want to thank Gary for sharing his insights and work with us, and also thank everybody for attending today's webinar. If you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to us at corwin.com. And we hope you'll be back with us next week as we talk with Jackie Walsh and Beth Sadis about 3 key aspects of quality questioning. You can register for that at corwin.com/webinars if you'd like to join us. And we hope to see you at this time again next week. So thank you very much for joining us. And thank you, Gary, for the presentation. And I hope everybody has a good evening.
Thank you.